Welcome to the creepy story for sleep. Get ready to dive into the most terrifying stories you've ever heard. But before we begin, tell me, from which city are you watching this video? Leave it in the comments below, and if you're brave enough to face the terror that's coming, show your support with a. My girlfriend would answer one question every night in her sleep. Jake, my 11-year-old son, blindsided me one day when he asked if we could go camping. I nearly spit out my lukewarm coffee in surprise. This was coming from the same kid who complained about the sun's brightness at soccer practice and whined about mosquitoes at night. So when he suddenly expressed interest in camping, I couldn't help but chuckle. It was such a far cry from his usual pastime of being glued to anything with a screen. We were hanging out by my truck one morning, talking about school, when Jake first mentioned camping. He nudged a pebble along the dry road, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Hey Dad," he began hesitantly, "think we could go camping sometime?" I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear. Apparently Jake's friend Daniel had been endlessly bragging about a camping trip he went on with his dad, making the great outdoors suddenly irresistible to my screen-obsessed son. "Camping, huh?" I said, trying to contain my excitement. "Sounds great, but it's not all fireflies and s'mores. There's bugs, for one thing. Lots of 'em." Jake grimaced, his enthusiasm briefly dimming. "Yeah, I know," he mumbled, kicking at the dirt with his sneakers. I gave him a playful nudge. "If the weather holds, maybe we can just find a good spot by the lake next weekend. Just you and me. You up for it?" "Yeah," Jake said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. His response to the lake idea didn't seem genuine. A subtle shrug and a glimmer of disappointment in his eyes revealed his desire for a more immersive experience, one that involved tents, campfires, and a genuine escape into nature. Merely visiting the lake wouldn't cut it. Only a true camping trip would satisfy him. Truth be told, I hadn't been camping in years. Fond memories of childhood fishing trips and backyard campouts with my own dad felt like a lifetime ago. Work had a way of taking over, and lately, it had been consuming more than its fair share. But after listening to Jake's retelling of Daniel's camping trip story, it had stirred something in me, a friendly rivalry. I was suddenly determined to one-up Daniel and his dad, to make sure my boy had the camping trip of a lifetime. A grin spread wide across my face as I promised Jake, "Yeah, you know what, Jake? We're gonna go camping, and it's going to be the best camping trip ever. As soon as I can take a break from work, we'll go." Jake's excitement was contagious. He jumped up and down with joy, and I couldn't help but laugh. It hit me then that I probably should have introduced him to camping sooner. "Thank you, Dad," he shouted, his voice ringing with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you." I gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "All right, champ, let's simmer down a bit," I chuckled. "Head inside and get started on your homework. We don't want Mom holding this over our heads," I added with a wink. Jake nodded eagerly and practically skipped into the house, leaving me with a warm sense of fatherly pride. The weeks flew by, and I finally managed to snag some time off work. In the evenings, I'd pore over articles and videos on wilderness survival and the delicate art of s'more making. My childhood camping memories were more fuzzy nostalgia than concrete know-how, and I couldn't let my lack of experience show, not in front of Jake, and certainly not in front of that Daniel. Meanwhile, my ever-supportive wife, Sarah, decided to forego the mosquitoes and campfire smoke for the comfort of our home. She said it was girl time with a good book and a long bath, but I couldn't help but sense a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Traitor," I jokingly tease, reminding her of our grand mission to outshine Daniel and his dad's camping trip. She'd just laugh and say, Go conquer the wilderness, honey. I'll be here holding down the fort. It was true that Sarah wasn't exactly an outdoors enthusiast. She enjoyed a leisurely stroll in the park, but multi-day camping trips weren't her cup of tea. Still, I knew she secretly loved seeing Jake and me bond, and deep down, I hoped this men versus wild adventure might reignite my own forgotten love for the outdoors. My mission? Mastering the art of building a fire that wouldn't leave us all choking on smoke, identifying constellations for Jake, hoping I wouldn't mix up Orion with the Big Dipper, and maybe even catching a fish or two, although, based on my past fishing experiences, that might be the biggest challenge of all. It was time to put my crash course in wilderness survival to the test and create an unforgettable camping trip for Jake, one that even Daniel and his dad couldn't top. At last, the weekend we've been waiting for arrived. That Friday, as I picked Jake up from school, excitement buzzed through the car as we pulled into the driveway. The moment we stepped through the front door, Jake's eyes widened in amazement at the sight of the camping gear I had meticulously, or so I thought, laid out for him like a treasure trove for an intrepid explorer. The living room had transformed into a chaotic staging ground for our trip. A giant, green tent bag rested at his feet, while two mismatched sleeping bags, one a vivid orange, the other in subdued camouflage, leaned precariously against the table. Beside two overstuffed backpacks, I proudly displayed a bounty of rations, mostly marshmallows, chocolate bars, and enough instant ramen to feed a small army. Ready to conquer the wild with me? I asked. Jake didn't disappoint. His eyes sparkled with an unspoken thrill that seemed to shout, I can't wait to tell Daniel I went camping too. With the car packed to the brim and threatening to keel over at any sharp turn, Sarah pulled me aside just before we left. Her usually bright and playful eyes held a seriousness that cut through my usual humor. Please, be careful out there, she said, her voice tinged with worry. I knew this wasn't the moment for jokes. Squeezing her hand, I gave her a reassuring nod. We'll be fine, I promised, hoping my confident smile would hide any lingering anxieties about my own lack of camping expertise. Jake and I settled into the car, the engine rumbling with the promise of adventure. Determined to make Daniel and his dad's Crystal Lake camping trip look like a backyard picnic, I'd scoured maps and forums for the perfect spot. Jake had mentioned that Daniel and his father had gone camping at the Crystal Lake campgrounds, conveniently close to our town. Crystal Lake? I teased, as if it were the last place any self-respecting outdoorsman would pitch a tent. We're going somewhere way better, I added with a wink. Our destination was Whisperwood Forest, a hidden camping ground 3 hours north. As the miles stretched before us, Jake peppered me with questions, his enthusiasm keeping the energy high. Are there bears in Whisperwood? He asked, eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. Maybe, I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, though a flicker of unease ran through me. The forums did mention some black bear sightings. But that's why we have all this camping gear, right? To be prepared for anything. Jake's questions ranged from the practical, will there be a bathroom, to the fantastical, do you think we'll see Bigfoot? By the time the landscape outside our window blurred into a patchwork of greens and browns, his voice had grown hoarse, and a peaceful silence settled over the car. We veered off the main road, following the rhythm of a narrow dirt path sneaking through the dense forest. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead, casting long, dancing shadows on the dusty track. The air hung heavy with the earthy scent of damp moss and decaying leaves, punctuated by the occasional chirp of an unseen bird. With every bend and dip, the car swayed alongside us, its tires crunching on loose gravel. I caught a glimpse of Jake in the rearview mirror, his head bobbing with every bump, his eyes wide with anticipation and fixed on the passing scenery. After about 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing, the sudden brightness of unfiltered sunlight momentarily blinding me. As my eyes adjusted, I took in the scene. The clearing was modest in size, about the size of a tennis court. In its center stood a gnarled oak, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms. An eerie silence enveloped the area, interrupted only by the rustle of leaves in the still air. I brought the car to a gentle stop, the engine sighing softly as it died. Jake's eyes sparkled with anticipation as he looked over at me. "Ready?" I asked, my voice echoing in the sudden stillness. His nod was eager and swift. As I stepped out, my joints popped like distant firecrackers. I retrieved our backpacks from the trunk and hoisted the tent onto my shoulder, its weight familiar and grounding. I let Jake take the lead as we scouted for a camping spot. I knew it was important for him to feel like the captain of our adventure, the leader of our expedition. Watching his determined strides and furrowed brow as he surveyed the land like a seasoned explorer was hilarious. Eventually, we found a suitable spot, or rather, my son did, tucked away from the car and hidden by thick underbrush. Sunlight danced through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on a carpet of moss and ferns. Nearby, a crystal-clear stream burbled, its melody harmonizing with the chirping symphony of unseen insects. It was a secluded paradise, the perfect refuge for me and my son, nestled away from the world within the forest's embrace. With a proud grin, Jake declared our campsite found. While he scampered off to explore the nearby stream, I tackled the seemingly straightforward task of pitching the tent. However, the instructions were akin to cryptic hieroglyphs, filled with diagrams resembling abstract art and terminology that would challenge even a seasoned scholar. 20 minutes later, after much head-scratching and muttered curses, the tent stood, albeit with a noticeable lean to one side. "Behold," I announced, trying to hide the beads of sweat gathering on my forehead. Jake, ever the diplomat, simply grinned. "Coolest tent ever, Dad." As we unrolled our sleeping bags inside the tent, I sent Jake on a mission to gather sticks for our fire. He scampered off into the undergrowth while I patrolled the edge of the woods, collecting stray logs to bolster our firewood stash. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a figure peeking from behind a tree, but dismissed it as a trick of the fading light. Igniting a fire, often portrayed in movies with a single dramatic swipe of a flint, turned into a comedic ballet of fumbled matches and stubborn kindling. My attempts at channeling my inner caveman were met with sputtering defiance from the damp sticks. After 20 minutes of frustration, I surrendered to the ease of modern technology and pulled a lighter from my backpack. As if sensing my defeat, the fire roared to life with a satisfying crackle. I called Jake back, and together we roasted marshmallows under the shifting hues of the evening sky. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with fiery shades of orange and red, we shared stories and laughter, leaving behind the worries of city life for the simple joy of being together in the wild. As the clock neared 9 p.m., exhaustion settled over us like a warm blanket. Jake, his eyelids drooping like weighted curtains, readily agreed it was bedtime. I subdued the fire with a few nudges from my boot, but instead of fading completely, the embers seemed to pulse with an unnatural inner light, casting dancing shadows across the forest floor. The usual nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves took on an unsettling tone. A distant howl pierced the silence, long and mournful, similar to an owl's call yet somehow different from any I'd heard before. A chill ran down my spine, prompting me to pull Jake closer and tuck him snugly into his sleeping bag. "Just an owl, champ," I reassured him, trying to sound confident despite my unease. My voice echoed strangely inside the tent, adding to the eerie atmosphere, but Jake, already drifting off to sleep, remained unfazed. Before I knew it, my eyes had closed, and I'd drifted off. It felt like no time had passed before a soft nudge at my shoulder stirred me awake. Squinting in the dark, I made out Jake sitting bolt upright, looking at me. "What's wrong?" I mumbled, my voice heavy with sleep. "Shoo," he whispered, his voice trembling. "There's something outside." Half asleep, I assured him it was probably just a squirrel or a similar creature and encouraged him to try and sleep. I turned onto my side, seeking the comforting embrace of sleep once more. But before it could claim me again, I heard it, a sequence of sounds distinct from the forest's usual symphony. Footsteps, deliberate and measured footsteps, circled our tent. These weren't the light steps of a deer or the clumsy thudding of a bear. There was no natural rhythm to them, no telltale snap of a twig. They were silent, calculated movements, 2 steps, a pause, 2 more steps, a pause, as if whatever lurked outside was deliberately trying to be quiet. 2 minutes stretched into an eternity before the pattern resumed, 2 deliberate steps, a pause, and then 2 more steps. Wiping the sleep from my eyes, I propped myself up. A glance at Jake confirmed he was still awake, his eyes wide with terror. In a hushed tone, I promised to investigate. He gave a small nod, and with a deep breath, I inched forward, my hand trembling as I unzipped the tent just a crack. Peering through the gap, I found the darkness outside impenetrable, the only light source being the faint embers of our extinguished campfire. Squinting, I strained to see beyond the flickering red glow. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a figure near the tree line, a subtle shift in the shadows that seemed to move on silent feet. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning my tired sanity. Turning back to Jake, I forced a reassuring smile. "Everything's okay, champ. Go back to sleep." Whatever lurked outside wasn't any creature I recognized, and it showed no signs of leaving. As we settled back into our sleeping bags, a sudden noise shattered the silence, jolting me awake. It wasn't the familiar rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. This was a sharp crack, a deep, resonant snap of a fallen branch, weighty and too close for comfort. A cold sweat instantly coated my skin. Whatever had caused that sound was heavy. Quietly, I rose from my sleeping bag, the tent floor feeling small and exposed beneath me. Retrieving my flashlight, I unzipped the tent fully with deliberate care. The chilly night air rushed in, stealing my breath momentarily. With trembling hands, I switched on the flashlight and swept its beam across the surrounding woods. The once familiar trees now loomed ominously in the darkness. Shadows danced and twisted in the flickering light, playing tricks on my already rattled mind. I scanned the forest floor for any sign of the creature, a footprint, a snapped twig, but found nothing. Yet, just beyond the flashlight's reach, a glimmer caught my eye, a subtle movement, a flash of reflection. I focused the beam in that direction, my heart pounding, but saw only the swaying branches of a nearby pine. Convinced the source of the noise was ahead of me, I had turned away from the tent. However, the sound of leaves crunching behind me shattered that assumption. Whirling around, I aimed the flashlight toward the tent, partially illuminating my son, who sat upright with a confused expression. Whatever had made the noise remained out of sight. I had almost convinced myself it was merely a curious animal nosing around behind our tent. Just as I was about to dismiss the fear and retreat into the safety of the tent, ready to label the sounds as harmless, the source of the noise revealed itself, a moment that stretched my sanity thin. It stood up from behind the opposite end of the tent, where it had been hiding. It, or me, standing over the tent, partially bathed in the weak glow of my flashlight, it defied all logic and reason. Even as I stared directly at it, my mind struggled to accept what my eyes were seeing. It wasn't an animal, as I had initially assumed. It was me. I found myself locked in a gaze with myself. It had my face, but it wasn't me. Its limbs extended from misaligned joints at the shoulders, longer and more spindly than mine. Though humanoid in shape, its proportions were wrong, its limbs extending at unnatural angles. Clad in tattered clothes akin to my camping attire, its body seemed like a grotesque mirror image of my own. The most unsettling part was its face. It mirrored mine in almost every detail, save for the eyes' voids of absolute blackness in place of my familiar brown eyes. When caught in the beam of my flashlight, those eyes revealed twin specks of light within the darkness, staring back at me with an unnerving intensity. A single glance revealed its formidable strength, far surpassing my own. Its arms, thick with sinewy muscle, bore the unmistakable markings of a life lived in the wilderness. These were not the sculpted muscles of a gym goer, but the rugged strength forged by the trials of nature itself. Mountains climbed, rivers crossed, battles waged against the elements. As its mouth contorted grotesquely across its face, the skin splitting like parched earth, a wet tearing filled the night air, an agonizing sound that sent a primal scream echoing through my mind. The chill of the night was now a distant memory, replaced by a fear so profound it threatened to immobilize me. Suddenly, a voice pierced the silence, a small, vulnerable voice belonging to Jake, calling out from within the tent, asking if I could see anything. At the sound of his voice, the creature's attention shifted sharply toward the tent. It leaned in, drawn by Jake's innocence. Its already unnaturally wide mouth stretched further, the lower jaw unhinging to an impossible length, revealing a menacing row of needle-like teeth. The thing raised its elongated arm, which moved unnervingly stiff and jerky, like the movements of someone who hadn't felt flesh beneath their fingertips for years. I could see each joint crackle and pop as it extended its arm. I was confused as to what it was doing, but then realization hit me. Instinct took over. I plunged my hands into the tent, grabbing Jake, and yanked him out with all my strength. Yanking him from the tent, we stumbled out, the ground a sickening blur beneath my feet. We landed in a heap, the sound of ripping fabric filling the air as the creature tore through the tent like a child ripping through tissue paper. The metallic tang of blood, sharp and acrid, filled my nostrils. I covered Jake's mouth with my hand, feeling his tears against my skin. We lay there in silence, watching the thing eviscerate our tent. Amidst the chaos, my bag was flung towards us. Recognizing it, I rummaged through it until my fingers closed around the car keys. Leaning close to Jake, I told him when I gave the signal, I wanted him to run for the car. In the tense silence that followed the creature's assault, a distant noise momentarily captured its attention. Seizing the opportunity, I whispered to Jake, "Run." We sprang up and bolted towards the car, the creature's piercing shriek chasing us from behind. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed on, fueled by a primal urge to protect my son. Reaching the car, I fumbled with the keys, the creature's rasping breaths hot on my neck. With a satisfying click, the door unlocked. We tumbled inside, slamming the door shut just as the creature lunged forward, its fingers scraping against the metal. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. In the dim light, I could see the creature standing mere inches from the car, its grotesque smile contorted in what seemed to be frustration. With a surge of adrenaline, I shifted into reverse, then spun the car around, tires churning the earth as we sped down the trail. We didn't stop until we got home. Throughout the drive, Jake remained silent, his soft sobs a stark contrast to my own stifled emotions. That night marked the end of our camping trips. It doesn't look like I'll be beating Daniel and his dad's camping trip anytime soon. I'm a 24-year-old man. I live in a rather remote and rural town in Michigan. I especially enjoy going out in the forest near my small town. On one particular camping trip that I will never forget, I encountered something that made me question the true nature of reality. On one particular day around 6 years ago, I decided to go out in the nearby woods. It was the summer after I graduated from high school. The hardware store that I was working at went out of business a week prior to this story. Since I lost my job and I was bored, I decided to go on a 4-day shooting and camping trip. I packed up my shotgun that my grandfather gave to me for my 16th birthday. For food, I got some ramen noodles, a carton of eggs, graham crackers, and hot dogs. I also packed up a sleeping bag and a tent. So I got into my old pickup truck and drove to the forest. I parked in a nearby grassland, and I walked into the woods with my gear. It took me around 3 hours to find a perfect place to set up camp. I rested for another 2 hours before I decided to go find somewhere to fire off some rounds. I had this uneasy feeling that I was being watched. No matter how hard I tried, I could never shake it off. Sometimes I heard twigs snapping or footsteps behind me. But when I went to investigate, nothing was there. So I just went back to my business, putting up some used milk jugs as targets for me to shoot. I spent maybe an hour or two shooting my shotgun. Afterwards, I cooked up the ramen noodles for dinner. It got dark pretty quick and I decided it was time for me to fall asleep. So I unfolded my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. As soon as I was fading off into sleep, I heard a deep demonic growl. I quickly grabbed my shotgun and loaded it, in preparation to defend myself. Suddenly, something slashed at my tent. The slash tore a very large hole in the tent's fabric. I respond by firing 3 shots at the intruder. The intruder let out a very high-pitched and ear-piercing scream. The assailant screamed so loud that it drowned out the gunshots. Whatever attacked my tent scurried away in the other direction. I was too frightened and shaken up to give chase. My ears felt like they were bleeding, both from the thing's screams and gunshots of my shotgun. I spent the rest of the night sitting next to a tree with my shotgun in my hand. I did not get a good look at my would-be attacker, due to how dark it was out. However, from the brief glimpse of the silhouette that I got, the figure seemed quite humanoid, but it definitely was not a human. That thing was also most certainly not a bear, as it was far too skinny and gaunt to be one. Whatever it was very thin to the point that it looked like someone who was severely malnourished. I don't know if my eyes were playing tricks on me or not, but I swore that the assailant had a coyote-like head. The morning came, and I investigated the area for any signs of my late-night visitor. For some strange reason, there wasn't any blood near my camp. I know for a certain fact that I actually hit that thing at nearly point-blank range. After walking around the area for a few minutes, I discovered some footprints. They were definitely bipedal, but not human. The footprints had 4 toes with very large dagger-like claw marks on each end. My guess is that they came from my little friend. I panicked and I decided it was time to leave. So I started to pack up all of my gear. The tent, due to it being too badly damaged to be useful from last night's attack, was simply left behind. I carefully scanned my environment for the creature. After I packed up all of my stuff, I started the long walk back to my truck. A camping trip just wasn't worth facing whatever that was. As I was walking, I carefully watched the environment around me. I scanned every body of water and every tree I could see for signs of that monster. There was always that unsettling feeling in my gut that I was being watched. What put me on edge the most was the forest was completely silent. Not a single bird was singing or even an insect chirping. All the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. After nearly 3 hours of walking in the forest, I suddenly heard loud crunching noises coming from behind me. When I turned around to look, it was the same creature from the night before. The creature looked like a decomposing corpse, with its rib cage and internal organs visible. It had a rotting coyote-like head, but with ratty human-like head hair that touched its shoulders. The creature's claws were around 4 inches long. It was so skinny that it looked like it hadn't eaten anything for an entire month. It was mostly hunched over, but I think it would have been around 6 feet 2 inches tall, fully erect. Most chilling of all were its piercing eyes that seemed to stare deep into my soul. I fired another round at the creature with my shotgun, but this time it was unfazed. Realizing that my gun was now useless against the creature, my flight instincts took in and I ran for my life. Within no time, the creature ran right behind me. I felt the creature's heavy breathing on my neck. Just when all of my hope was lost, I saw my truck just across the grass. I was within yards of the forest's end. However, even with all of my adrenaline pumping, I was deeply fatigued and exhausted from all that running. Despite nearly fainting, I summoned enough energy to sprint to my truck. Just as I reached my truck, I felt a heavy blow hit the left side of my body. I was sent flying a few feet. When I landed on the ground, I ended up spraining my leg pretty badly. The creature walked over to me. It then grabbed my shirt's collar with one hand and hoisted me up in the air. I pulled out my knife and stabbed it in the face. The creature dropped me on the ground. I grabbed the shotgun and started beating the creature with the butt of my gun. After seeing me fighting back, the creature scampered back into the trees as if it had its tail between its legs. After the creature fled, I limped back to my truck. I put all of my gear in the truck's bed, climbed inside, and sped off as fast as I could. I never returned to that part of the forest again. Knowing that they wouldn't believe me, I also never told my family what happened. I run a private campground, and let me tell you, it's a more stressful job than it seems. Between the casual murder committed by my former bestie Beau, deal with it, shippers, and the recent slew of 2-star reviews from folks that don't understand that I can't control the weather, it's enough to drive anyone to ordering IHOP pancakes for dinner like a trash human being. If you're like, wow, that's very specific, Kate, yes. Yes, it is very specific. Except my town is too small for any delivery services to be in range, so I ordered it to my brother's house and showed up on his doorstep to collect it like don't ask questions, and left with my bag of shame in hand. If you're new here, you should really start at the beginning, and if you're totally lost, this might help. I wasn't very good about responding to the comments in my last post. I got behind and then just stayed behind. But I did notice that a handful of you had thoughts on the origin of the shepherd and what the branch he carries is. I looked up the suggestions, and it is a cypress branch. This is why it's helpful to have a diverse group when you're trying to find solutions to a problem. You never know where a good idea will come from. Unfortunately, that's about the only thing I was able to verify. I haven't seen the shepherd since our last encounter, which I suppose isn't necessarily a bad thing. He only shows up when the frost is literally trying to drag me into an icy grave, or when I'm mourning someone's death. I could do without both of those. But just because I haven't seen the shepherd doesn't mean he still hasn't had an effect on my campground. Catalysts are unexpected things. The human world is in many ways a mirror of our own, and we find symbolism in everything from storms to an oddly shaped rock. We find significance in innocuous objects and actions. A kind word from a stranger in a grocery store may trigger an emotional breakthrough. A teacup sitting on a shelf may bring back memories of a long-lost relative. A padlock left locked on a fence symbolizes your devotion. In stories, the big ones, the catalyst is often something huge and important. A magical sword or a prophecy fulfilled. But the little stories, the ones about the creatures around us every day, those are the small, subtle things. Those are the catalysts we are more likely to encounter. A bit of food shared with a stranger. A glance at someone you perhaps should have passed by with no notice. A stone perched precariously on another stone that you chanced to touch. I think my act of looking at the shepherd was a catalyst. The frost has altered itself. I do not think the shepherd was the cause of it. Bo has described a web before, in which I thrash, blind to the consequences. My simple act of looking at the shepherd may have been a catalyst that shifted something in my land, and now I am left with the results. And the results are bad. A slew of 1- and 2-star reviews never looks good for a business. Fortunately, we didn't have anything big happening in the middle of this week. We have campers every day now, as people are taking summer vacations, but the numbers are manageable. I shudder to think of what would have happened had this occurred during one of our big events. I've said many times before that I'm an early riser. I like to make a lap around the campground while other people are still waking up with their hangovers to make sure nothing unfortunate happened overnight. Plus, it's hard to sleep through the little girl being dragged away by the beast, so I tend to wake at dawn anyway. Normally I enjoy some coffee first, but this time I decided to make it to go. It was ready by the time I finished hastily dressing, so I poured it into a thermos and hurried to fetch my four-wheeler from the garage. I needed to get a look at my campground as soon as I could. Because when I woke, I found that my windows were completely frosted over. In June, with weather that is routinely in the 80s. My garage rattled open and I stared in horror at what lay beyond. A thin sheet of ice covered my driveway, as if it had slept overnight. The grass was similarly iced over. I looked at the forest, dreading what I would see. I expected trees bent over from the weight of the ice. Branches broken off. Utter carnage that would take so much money and years to repair. But the trees were clear. Their leaves rippled gently in the early morning breeze. And the ground glittered like it was littered with diamonds in the growing sunlight. I carefully eased the four-wheeler out onto the ice. Fortunately, I have experience driving on ice. I try not to, but sometimes the campground needs something done in the winter, and of course there's groceries to be gotten, and our snow removal system around here is only slightly better than wait for spring. Let me tell you, going slow and careful is way more stressful when you're in a hurry. I needed to know how the overnight campers on site had fared. I can't say that I was starting to relax by the time I got through most of the campgrounds, but at least my white knuckles were mostly because of the ice on the road at that point. The campsites I checked on were all okay. I found one site that had a few early risers, and I briefly stopped to speak to them. No, nothing odd had happened overnight. They'd slept through this freak ice storm, they said. No temperature drop. The ice hadn't even stuck to their tent or anything else they'd brought. Just the ground. One of them asked if this was why rule number 15 existed, and while I was grateful that someone had read the pamphlet, I mumbled that yeah, sure, it was something like that, and then drove off before they could ask more questions. I didn't want to tell them that there were no freak ice storms in the area and that the ice was coming up out of the ground. I wanted to make sure everyone was okay and then drive around keeping an eye on people in paranoid anxiety until the ice melted. I reasoned that it had to melt at some point, right? And if it didn't, I supposed I could invite over that one slightly related aunt that tries to chat up my staff for gossip when they visit the town hardware store, and then murder her to summon the shepherd. I was keeping that idea as plan D. If you're like, wow Kate, That's pretty high up on the list for something that involves murder. Maybe you haven't changed them much. Look, there was no plan E. I just didn't have a lot of good ideas to deal with the situation. Plan A was literally drive around and hope for the best. I only made a couple laps of the upper parts of the campground before Plan A failed spectacularly. As I was coming up to the hill that led to the deep woods, I heard some alarming noises coming from further in the forest. There weren't any campers in the deep woods. I didn't explicitly forbid people from camping down there at this time of the year, but I discouraged it with mundane reasons. Water hookups are further apart. It tends to flood when it rains. Less accessible by road, so you have to haul your stuff further. Harder to find clear areas to set up tents. When there's a lot of shaded, lovely camping spots further uphill, no one finds any reasons to keep going. I hastily radioed the staff that were already on site and told them to take over for me in patrolling the campground. I warned them to use the four-wheelers and leave the golf carts in the shed, even though that meant less people out checking on campers. I don't trust the golf carts on ice. Then I got off my four-wheeler and carefully began to walk down the hill into the deep woods. Yes, I went on foot. I had to. There was no way that four-wheeler was getting down that hill without sliding, and I wasn't confident I wouldn't be able to keep it from rolling in the process. As it was, I had to sort of crouch and let myself slide down the hill like I was ice skating. I only stood up once I had come to a stop. The sound was somewhere ahead and to the right of me. I heard the breaking of branches and my heart sank. Maybe the ice had managed to make its way up the trees and they were collapsing under its weight. I resolved to go just as far as I needed to confirm at a distance that was all that was happening. Falling branches can be incredibly dangerous, after all. It's not really something most people think about, I imagine, until emergency workers are pulling them out from under a tree and their hip is in 4 too many pieces. Be careful when it's windy or icy is all I'm saying. Anyway, I kept going at a careful pace towards the source of the sound. It grew louder and I realized I was nearing it much faster than I anticipated. Nervously, I stopped and listened, peering through the trees. The sunlight reflected off the ice on the ground and blinded me, turning everything in front of me into a glittering blur. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing. Something was moving. And the sound of breaking branches was growing louder. It was coming towards me. I hastily turned around and began heading back down the road towards the hill leading out of the deep woods. The frost was responsible. This was all I needed to know. I didn't really need to see for myself what was happening. I walked as quickly as I dared, not looking behind me. I could tell I was still being followed by the sound of snapping branches alone. I didn't need to risk a fall by looking away from the ground directly in front of me. I couldn't afford a busted wrist or worse, a busted ankle right now. So I kept going, heart pounding, step by step on treacherous terrain. And all the while the sound of something pursuing me grew louder. The branches were being ripped violently from the trees and the canopy shook as if in a storm. My mind played images of the horse-eater, a desiccated, rotting body with a single glowing eye pursuing me through the frozen forest in search of revenge. I resolutely shoved them aside. I had to stay calm. It didn't mean I wasn't afraid, but I couldn't let that overtake me. I had to keep moving ahead. I risked a backwards glance when I reached the hill. I finally needed to know what was pursuing me. It would be easier to get up the hill if I veered into the forest because I could find purchase in the soft earth, but I'd risk being directly under the largest branches if I went off the road. But if I stayed on the road, I would be significantly slower. I had to choose which risk to take. So I looked. It was a tornado. Not a big one. not like we see in movies. The top of it extended no further than the canopy, and it was about as wide as a car. But still, it was a tornado. In my forest. At first I thought it was carrying a mass of broken branches in its body. It was hard to see because instead of dirt, it was ripping up ice from the ground. It shone like a disco ball, a riot of crystalline shards catching the light like little stars. Then I realized the color was off. It wasn't a muddy brown gray. It was paler. And then a hand reached out of the whirlwind, grabbed hold of a nearby tree branch, and snapped it clean off before discarding it to the ground. A pale hand, coated with a lattice of frost. Those weren't branches it was carrying. It was bodies. And we thought the yarn balls were bad. I hastily veered off the road and into the dirt. I needed all the speed I could muster to get away from this thing. I caught another glimpse in the edge of my vision as I scrambled sideways towards the forest. More hands were stretching out of the glittering whirlwind, and the crack of branches echoed through the woods as their frozen fingers closed on the nearby trees. A face peered out at me before being whirled away, mouth agape, eyes blank. Then I was clawing my way forwards, scrambling up the hill on all fours. The frozen ground was harder to break through than I anticipated. My feet slipped as I sought to punch my heels through the layer of ice. My fingers slid futility on the surface, so I grabbed at the trees instead, pulling my body along, lunging for the next tree when it wasn't within reach. I made it halfway before I slipped. I fell, landing on my side, and began to slide backwards. I flailed about in a panic, trying to roll myself over, spreading my arms and legs out in an attempt to gain some traction. The terrain sloped down towards the road, and so that was the direction I fell, and I knew I had to stop myself before I reached it, before I turned into a flat surface of packed earth, covered by a sheet of ice with no handholds to save myself with. I snagged a sapling just as my body spun slowly onto the surface of the road. My heart pounded in my chest while the sapling bent under my weight. Tentatively, I brought one foot up underneath me. Another. Something grabbed me from behind. Hands closed on either arm and lifted me up. I admit I screamed. Flailed a bit too, trying to kick, punch, or bite my assailant. I'm glad I didn't succeed on that last one. Campground manager, a voice said sternly from behind me. We are not your foes this day. I quieted. I recognized the voice. The harvesters. I glanced around me and saw that one had me by either arm and the rest were grouped behind me. I could see the tornado over their heads. It was moving sluggishly towards the bottom of the hill, but we were moving faster than it. The harvesters were having no problems walking on the ice, and they were taking me up the hill with them. I sagged in relief, the adrenaline cooling quickly in my blood and leaving me shaking. Did you come to rescue me? I asked. No. We were already on our way out of the deep woods and you happened to be ahead of us. I glanced behind us. The tornado had veered away from the hill. It was staying in the deep woods. You're fleeing from it, I said softly. The one to my right nodded slightly in assent. Is everything getting out of its way? I continued. Another nod, which meant that all these inhuman things would be lurking in the rest of the campground. My campers were no longer safe where they were. The harvesters released me at the top of the hill and I collected myself and then thanked them for their help. I didn't intend to stick around for a longer conversation. They might have helped me in the past and they might actually be useful, but that didn't engender any affection for me. I can like the end result of their actions but still loathe them for the way they go about it. The harvesters, unfortunately, had business with me before I could leave. "We are concerned," one of them said. "I'm working on the frost situation," I growled. "This just started this morning. Give me a break here." They shook their heads as a group. Not in unison, for their hive mind was not absolute, so that put the gesture slightly lower on the creepy scale. "Still pretty creepy, though." "That is not for us to interfere with," another said dismissively. "Another has claimed it." Great, so there went any hope of recruiting them for another round of inhuman versus inhuman problem solving. Apparently they were content to let the shepherd fend for himself. I tersely asked them exactly what they were concerned about. I didn't really want to hear the answer. It's just when you're faced with a half dozen or so inhuman things known for casually vivisecting people that piss them off, you go along with whatever it is they want with you. But no, I still get campers that are like, "I tried to punch the creepy scalpel-wielding faceless raincoat people and now I'm down a lung. However did this go wrong?" "There is a void in the campground," they said. "I about had a damn heart attack, thinking that perhaps fixing the thing in the dark had gone wrong and now the gray world had formed a supernatural black hole somewhere, but no, they were being figurative. Though I'm not sure their explanation was any better. Old land is too attractive of a territory for inhuman things. Creatures like them could reside easily on old land, but they were not the type to assume any sort of role of significance. They were lesser creatures, and they said this without a trace of embarrassment or resentment. It simply was what they were, just as gravity is a force we accept as fact. There were greater creatures on this land. Were. The Fomorian. The thing in the dark. All gone now. And what about the beast? I asked. "It is occupied with your family line," one replied, "and is of no concern to us." "What if it starts taking interest in the rest of the campground?" "If that time comes, there will be nothing you can do to assist us." I fell into an uneasy silence after that. I understood their meaning all too well. The beast would only lose interest in my family once we were wiped out. No, they were more concerned about what this void might attract. It was old land, after all, turning ancient. An attractive proposition for any inhuman thing, particularly the more powerful ones that see territory ripe for the taking. My land might attract another Fomorian or something like it. It might attract something worse. My heart sank. Everything I've done so far isn't enough. I've always known that old land attracts creatures and that sometimes we get things from the outside. Maybe I hoped there would be an end to this someday. That the land would stabilize because I'd killed everything that needed killing and I could live in peace until I was old and felt like it was my time to go. Or maybe I'll be doing this the rest of my life. Fighting every damn day. They laughed. I stared back down into the deep woods and listened as the cracking of branches grew fainter. The tornado wasn't coming up the hill, but I didn't want to risk having people around until I knew for certain it was constrained to the deep woods. I needed to convince the campers to leave and then shut down for a day or more. Which meant issuing refunds. I hate issuing refunds. I told my staff to put the employee with the best customer service voice at the front desk and maybe slip them a bottle of whiskey for when everyone was gone. I'd be responsible for going camp to camp asking people to leave. At least I had a ready excuse. "We're under a tornado watch," I told them. A couple of them checked their phones in confusion. One of them protested when they saw the forecast. The sky was clear, after all, they said angrily. "And it was clear last night when we got this freak ice storm," I said through clenched teeth. "The weather in this area can change dramatically in a very short amount of time. I trust the local forecaster way more than I do some latte-sipping skinny jean-wearing nerd that only sees the light of day through the window of their multi-million-dollar daycare for programmers." Turns out they were a programmer themselves, so that's how I got at least one of those one-star reviews, I'm sure. I'm a campground manager. I just feel tired right now. Tired and frustrated. Don't get me wrong, like how am I going to give up? Maybe I will have to fight every damn day to keep this campground running. I kind of feel like I've been doing that all along and am only now starting to realize how hard the struggle is. I wonder if it wore on my parents. They at least had each other, though. I wonder if that was enough. I wonder about why my mother left that window open. I guess I'm going to have to shove those thoughts aside from now. The frost tornado is staying in the deep woods, but it has forced everything else out. Bo has dropped by and he is not pleased about this development. I can't really have campers out here when there's a bunch of ticked-off inhumans roaming the area they'd be camping in. So no income until I get this problem fixed. Maybe this isn't healthy, but it's the solution I'm familiar with, and it's a solution that's worked in the past. I'm tired. I'm frustrated. But most of all, I'm angry. I'm angry that the harvesters don't think I'm capable of defending my land. I'm angry that this is happening when I felt like I was just starting to make some real progress. And I'm angry that everything I've done so far could be undone if some new creature moves in. It's time to use that anger and punch a stupid corpse tornado right in its stupid fucking face.